He entered the world without ceremony, without celebration, and without even the most basic right to belong to himself. His birth was recorded not in a family Bible, but in the ledger of a plantation owner, written beside numbers that counted livestock and land. He was not given a name meant to last, he was given a label meant to identify property. From the moment he drew his first breath, the law had already decided his fate. He did not belong to his mother, though she carried him for months and cried silently as she held him for the first time. He belonged to a system that measured human worth in labor, obedience, and silence. His earliest memories were shaped by the rhythm of forced work, the crack of whips in the distance, and the unspoken understanding that fear was as natural as hunger. His mother's arms were his first refuge, but even they were not safe. She worked from sunrise to sunset, often returning to the slave quarters with hands raw and back bent, her exhaustion deeper than sleep. She taught him without words that crying too loudly could bring punishment, that eye contact with white men could invite violence, and that questions were dangerous. Love existed, but it had to hide. Laughter was quiet. Affection was brief. Every moment of tenderness carried the weight of knowing it could be taken away without warning. Children were sold. Families were broken. Nothing and no one was permanent except the plantation itself. As a child, he learned quickly that his body was not his own. He was expected to work as soon as he could stand for long periods. His small hands assigned tasks meant to teach obedience rather than skill. Fetching water, carrying messages, watching younger children while older ones labored in the fields, these were his lessons. Mistakes were punished not with correction but with pain. The overseer did not see a child struggling to understand. He saw a future worker who needed to be disciplined early. Fear became a teacher more consistent than any human voice. The plantation was a world designed to shrink the soul. The large house stood elevated, clean and guarded, while the slave quarters were cramped, cold in winter and suffocating in summer. He noticed early on how space itself was divided by race and power. The white children played freely, learned letters, and were spoken to with patience. He watched them from a distance, curious but invisible, aware that curiosity itself could be mistaken for defiance. He did not know the word freedom, but he understood its absence. It was in the way his mother flinched at sudden sounds, in the way adults lowered their voices when speaking of tomorrow, as if the future was something fragile that might shatter if named aloud. Hunger was a constant companion. Food was measured just enough to keep bodies working, never enough to nourish strength or hope. He learned to ignore the ache in his stomach and the weakness in his legs, because complaining changed nothing. Nights were filled with exhaustion so deep that dreams came quickly, but even sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of running without knowing where to go, of doors opening to places he had never seen, of his mother smiling without fear. Waking up was always the same, the bell, the commands, the reminder that another day belonged to someone else. Violence was woven into daily life, sometimes sudden and explosive, sometimes slow and humiliating. He witnessed punishments meant to be lessons for everyone watching, a man tied to a post for working too slowly, a woman beaten for speaking back. The cruelty was not always loud, sometimes it was the casual tearing apart of families, announced as if it were a change in weather. He learned to read emotions on faces, who was angry, who was dangerous, who might show a brief moment of mercy. Survival depended on awareness. Despite everything, something within him remained unbroken, though he did not yet have words for it. He asked questions silently, storing them deep inside. Why were some people allowed to rest while others collapsed from exhaustion? Why did the color of skin decide the value of a life? Why did God, spoken of so often by the masters, seem absent from the fields where suffering lived? These questions did not yet form rebellion, but they formed awareness, and awareness was the seed of everything that would come later. His mother tried to prepare him for a world she knew would not be kind. She told him stories at night, whispered tales passed down through generations, stories of ancestors taken from across the ocean, of lands where people lived without chains. She did not know if they were true anymore, but telling them was an act of resistance. Through her stories he learned that his condition was not natural, that there had been a before, and therefore there could be an after. Those stories became his inheritance, more valuable than anything the plantation could ever give. As he grew older, the expectations increased. Childhood ended early, replaced by longer hours and heavier work. He felt his body harden, not just with muscle but with caution. He learned when to speak and when silence was safer. He learned to hide pain because showing it invited more. Yet even as the system tried to erase his individuality, it failed completely. In quiet moments, while staring at the sky after a long day, he wondered what lay beyond the horizon. He did not know maps or borders, but he sensed that the world was larger than the fences that surrounded him. What made his existence most cruel was not only the labor or the violence, but the deliberate attempt to convince him that this was all he would ever be, that he was born for this purpose and no other. That hope itself was dangerous. And yet hope persisted, not loudly, not recklessly, but stubbornly. It lived in his survival, in his memory, in his refusal to forget that he was human, even when the law said otherwise. He was born without a name meant to be remembered, but he was born with a consciousness that refused to die. The system owned his body, but it never fully owned his mind. Even in chains, even before he understood the power of words, something within him was already preparing to speak. Learning to read and write was not presented to him as a gift or a right, but as a forbidden act whispered about with the same fear reserved for escape or rebellion. On the plantation, knowledge was power, and power was something enslaved people were never meant to possess. Laws were clear and merciless. A slave who learned letters threatened the entire system. He did not learn this from books, because books were kept far from his reach. He learned it from warnings, from sharp looks, from the way adults fell silent when the subject of reading came too close. Ignorance was enforced as carefully as labor, because a mind that could not read was easier to control. His first encounter with letters was accidental. A scrap of paper had fallen from a white child's lesson book, carried by the wind into a corner of the yard. The marks on it meant nothing at first, strange shapes, lines and oeuvres without sound, but something about them pulled at him. He felt, without understanding why, that those symbols carried meaning locked away from him. He stared at them until the paper was snatched away by an overseer's boot, crushed into the dirt, as if the marks themselves were dangerous. That moment planted a quiet hunger in him, one deeper than the hunger for food. He began to watch more closely. When the master's children recited their lessons aloud, he listened from a distance, pretending to work while memorizing sounds. He learned that letters made sounds, and sounds formed words, and words had the power to command, to explain, to record. He did not yet know how to read, but he knew enough to understand that literacy was the difference between those who gave orders and those who obeyed them. The realization frightened him and thrilled him at the same time. Learning came in fragments. A letter overheard here, a word remembered there. Sometimes a poor white laborer, careless or cruel in different ways, would ask him to fetch something and speak aloud from a written note. He memorized the shapes, repeating them in his mind long after the task was done. At night, in the darkness of the slave quarters, he traced letters in the dirt with his finger, hoping his memory was accurate. Each attempt felt like stepping onto thin ice. Discovery would mean punishment, possibly worse than anything he had yet endured. The danger was real and constant. He had seen what happened to others who were suspected of knowing too much. A man whipped for possessing a scrap of writing, a woman beaten for trying to teach her child the alphabet. These were not isolated events, they were warnings delivered publicly, designed to instill fear not just in the body but in the imagination. And yet, fear did not stop him. It sharpened his caution, but it could not extinguish his desire. What drove him was not rebellion at first, but curiosity. He wanted to know what was written in the Bible, passages read aloud on Sundays, passages that spoke of freedom and justice, while chains rested on living flesh. He wanted to know what was written in the contracts and letters that decided the fate of people like him without ever consulting them. Most of all, he wanted to know whether the world made sense when captured in words, or if it was as cruel and arbitrary on the page as it was in life. Eventually, someone noticed his attentiveness. An older enslaved man, who had once been allowed to work in a house and had picked up bits of reading before the rules tightened, saw the hunger in his eyes. Teaching him was dangerous for both of them, but the older man believed that some risks were worth taking. Lessons were brief and irregular, conducted in whispers, hidden behind routine tasks. A letter here, a syllable there. Progress was slow, but every new word felt like a door opening inside his mind. As his understanding grew, so did his awareness of his condition. Reading did not soften reality, it sharpened it. Words gave shape to injustices he had felt but could not articulate. He learned the language of ownership, the cold legal terms that reduced human lives to property. He learned the words used to justify cruelty, wrapped in scripture and law. Each new discovery was painful, but it was also clarifying. The system no longer felt like a natural order. It revealed itself as something constructed, maintained by force and fear. He learned to hide his knowledge well, to appear ignorant when ignorance was expected, to lower his eyes at the right moments. Literacy became a secret he carried alone, one that separated him from others even as it connected him to a larger, unseen world. There were moments of loneliness in this secrecy, moments when he wished he could share he was learning without risking everything. But he understood that survival required restraint. At the same time, literacy offered him a private refuge. In his mind, he could now escape in ways his body could not. He could imagine places he had never seen, futures not dictated by the plantation bell. He began to understand that words could outlive bodies, that writing could travel where people could not. This realization changed him. It gave him patience, it gave him purpose. Even when beaten or exhausted, he held on to the knowledge that what he was learning could not be taken from him as easily as his labor. The more he learned, the more dangerous his existence became. Knowledge brought not only clarity but responsibility. He could no longer claim innocence or ignorance. He knew too much about the lies that sustained slavery, and that knowledge burned within him. He began to understand why literacy was feared so deeply, because it allowed enslaved people to see themselves as part of history, not just victims of it. By the time he could read simple passages and write his own name, he was no longer the same person. His chains were still there, his circumstances unchanged, but his inner world had expanded beyond measure. He had committed what the system considered a crime, and in doing so, he had claimed the first piece of his freedom. Words had entered his life quietly, dangerously, and permanently, and nothing would ever fully silence them again. There came a point when silence stopped feeling like safety and began to feel like betrayal. For years, he had survived by keeping his head down, his thoughts hidden, his knowledge buried deep where no overseer could reach it. Silence had been a shield, a way to endure without inviting attention. But as time passed and his understanding grew, that same silence began to weigh on him. Every injustice he witnessed echoed louder in his mind, because now he had the words to name it. What once felt like survival started to feel like complicity, and that realization unsettled him more than fear ever had. He watched cruelty repeat itself with mechanical precision. New children were born into chains just as he had been. Families were torn apart without hesitation, their grief treated as an inconvenience. Punishments continued, sometimes for reasons so small they barely qualified as mistakes. He saw people broken not just in body but in spirit, slowly convinced that resistance was useless. Knowing what he knew, having seen what words could do, he struggled with the thought that he might live his entire life as a silent witness to this suffering. The knowledge that he could describe it, that he could record it, made his inaction feel heavier with each passing day. The internal conflict became constant. Speaking out could mean death, torture, or worse. Silence meant survival, but survival without purpose began to feel hollow. At night he replayed moments he wished he could erase, a woman screaming as her child was taken away, a man collapsing in the field and being beaten for slowing the work, a young boy punished harshly simply for asking a question. These scenes stayed with him, replaying themselves until they demanded something from him. He began to understand that his ability to read and write was not just a personal escape, it was a responsibility he had not asked for but could not ignore. He did not suddenly become brave. Courage came slowly, mixed with fear and doubt. He questioned whether his words would matter, whether anyone would care enough to listen. The world he lived in had trained him to believe that his voice was worthless. Even free people often ignored the cries of the enslaved. But another thought followed close behind. If no one spoke, the lie would continue unchallenged. The system depended on silence, on the absence of testimony. That realization sharpened his resolve. He began by writing privately, recording what he saw and felt, not yet for an audience, but to prove to himself that the truth existed. He described daily routines, punishments, conversations overheard, moments of quiet resistance. Writing became both a release and a risk. Every mark on paper was evidence that could condemn him if discovered. He hid his writings carefully, sometimes memorizing passages and destroying the paper to avoid detection. The act of writing itself felt dangerous, almost rebellious, but it also made him feel more alive than he ever had. As his confidence grew, so did his clarity. He realized that the power of his testimony lay in its honesty. He did not exaggerate or soften the truth. He understood that the reality of slavery was horrifying enough without embellishment. By writing plainly, he allowed the facts to speak for themselves. He imagined a reader who had never seen a plantation, who believed the comforting myths about slavery being humane or necessary. His words were meant to strip those illusions away. The decision to share his testimony beyond himself was the hardest step. Once words left his control, there would be no turning back. He thought of his mother, of the stories she had whispered in the dark, and of how she had endured without ever having the chance to be heard. He thought of those who had died without leaving a record of their lives. If he remained silent, their stories would vanish with them. That thought gave him strength even as it filled him with grief. He searched for a way to make his voice heard without immediately sealing his fate. Opportunities were rare and trust was dangerous. He learned to recognize small signs of sympathy in unlikely places, cautious glances, quiet gestures that suggested someone might listen. He knew betrayal was always a possibility. Choosing to speak to the wrong person could end everything. Yet doing nothing felt like a slower, more complete kind of death. As he wrestled with this choice, his understanding of freedom changed. Freedom was no longer just the absence of chains, it was the ability to tell the truth, to name injustice and demand recognition of one's humanity. Even if he never walked free, he wanted his words to do what his body could not. That idea gave him a sense of purpose that fear could not erase. The moment he fully accepted that he could no longer remain silent did not come with fanfare. It came quietly in the aftermath of yet another act of cruelty, when he realized that he would remember this pain forever, whether he spoke or not. If suffering was unavoidable, then so was responsibility. He chose to let his words become witnesses, to stand in places he could not stand himself. By deciding to speak, he crossed an invisible line. He was still enslaved, still vulnerable, but he was no longer only a victim. He became a recorder of truth, a man who refused to let cruelty pass unnoticed. His silence had once protected him, now his voice, however fragile, became his form of resistance. The final letter was not written in a moment of calm or safety. It was written under the constant shadow of discovery, with the knowledge that each word could be his last. By this point, his world had grown smaller, his movements more closely watched, his existence more fragile than ever. The system he had begun to challenge, even quietly, had a way of tightening its grip on those who showed signs of thinking beyond their assigned place. He felt it in the way overseers lingered longer, in the sudden searches, in the questions that carried suspicion beneath their surface. He understood that time was no longer something he could assume he had. The sea. Circumstances that pushed him toward writing this final letter were shaped by loss. Someone close to him had disappeared, sold, punished, or killed, the exact truth buried beneath silence and fear. This disappearance was not unusual on the plantation, but this time it struck him differently. It confirmed what he had long suspected: lives like his could vanish without record, without acknowledgement, as if they had never existed. The thought that his own story, and the stories of those around him, could be erased so completely filled him with urgency. If this letter were to be the last thing he ever wrote, then it had to matter. He chose his words carefully, not because he feared telling the truth, but because he wanted the truth to endure. He wrote not in anger, though anger would have been justified, but in clarity. He wanted no one to be able to dismiss his words as exaggeration or bitterness. He described what slavery did to people day after day, how it hollowed them out, how it trained them to doubt their own worth. He wrote about families broken apart, about faith twisted into a tool of control, about labor extracted through violence and fear. Each sentence carried the weight of lived experience. Writing while in chains was not only a physical reality, but a metaphor he understood deeply. His hands bore the marks of labor, scars that made holding a pen painful. He wrote in stolen moments, hiding the paper when footsteps approached, memorizing lines in case the letter had to be destroyed. The act of writing felt like defiance, not loud or dramatic, but steady and deliberate. With every word, he reclaimed a piece of himself that slavery had tried to erase. The letter was not addressed to one specific person at first. In his mind, it was meant for anyone willing to listen. He imagined readers who had never questioned the system they benefited from, who believed the myths told to make cruelty acceptable. He imagined them sitting comfortably, reading his words, and feeling the discomfort he had lived with his entire life. He did not beg for sympathy, he asked for recognition. Recognition that enslaved people were thinking, feeling human beings whose suffering was neither accidental nor necessary. As he wrote, memories surfaced uninvited. His mother's whispered stories, the first letter he ever learned to recognize, the faces of people who had not survived long enough to be heard. These memories guided his hand. He felt as if he were writing not only for himself, but for all of them. The letter became a collective voice, carrying experiences that had been silenced for generations. That responsibility weighed heavily on him, but it also gave him strength. He knew that if the letter were discovered, before it left his possession, the consequences would be severe. Punishment would not stop with him. Anyone suspected of helping could suffer as well. This knowledge forced him to make painful decisions about trust. Eventually, he chose to pass the letter to someone who moved between worlds, a person with limited freedom, someone who could travel beyond the plantation without immediate suspicion. Handing over the letter felt like surrendering control, but it was a necessary risk. Once the letter left his hands, its fate would no longer be tied entirely to his own. There was no dramatic farewell when he finished writing, no moment of triumph, only exhaustion and a quiet sense of finality. He understood that by putting his truth into words and sending it into the world, he had already crossed a point of no return. Whether the letter reached its destination or was destroyed, whether it changed anything or not, he had done what he believed was necessary. He had refused to let silence have the final word. In the days that followed, he lived with heightened awareness. Every sound seemed louder, every interaction heavier with meaning. He did not know if the letter had been delivered, read, or intercepted. He only knew that his truth was now in motion, no longer confined to his mind. That knowledge brought a strange peace. Even if his body remained in chains, his words were free in a way he never had been. The letter itself carried no dramatic declarations of heroism. It did not predict its own importance. It simply told the truth as he had lived it. Yet within that honesty lay its power. It challenged readers to confront realities they preferred to ignore. It demanded accountability, not through threats, but through undeniable human testimony. When he wrote the final lines, he did not know if he would live to see any response. He did not know if his name would ever be remembered. What he knew was this: the system that thrived on silence now had his words to contend with. In writing that letter, bound by chains yet guided by conviction, he ensured that even if his life ended quietly, his voice would not. The letter did not announce its arrival with fanfare or certainty. It moved quietly, passed from hand to hand, carried in pockets and hidden among ordinary papers, its significance not immediately obvious to everyone who encountered it. Yet those who read it closely felt its weight. It was not the polished writing of a politician or the fiery rhetoric of a seasoned activist. It was something rarer and more unsettling, the clear, unfiltered testimony of a man who had lived entirely under a system built to erase his voice. The authenticity of it made dismissal impossible. When the letter reached people already questioning slavery, it gave shape to arguments they had struggled to express. Here was evidence that could not be easily denied, a first-hand account that exposed the daily reality behind abstract deba. Tes. Abolitionists recognized its power immediately. They copied it, quoted it, and shared it, understanding that its strength lay not only in what it said, but in who had written it. A man born enslaved, denied education by law, had nevertheless found a way to speak with clarity and moral authority. That fact alone challenged the foundations of the system. As the letter circulated, it began to unsettle those who had previously remained neutral. Some readers had never owned slaves and had never set foot on a plantation. Slavery had existed for them as an idea, distant and uncomfortable, but easy to ignore. The letter refused to stay distant. It brought suffering into living rooms and meeting halls, forcing readers to confront the human cost of a system they had tolerated through indifference. Many found themselves disturbed not only by the cruelty described, but by the realization that such cruelty had been allowed to continue for so long. Newspapers began to reference the letter, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly. Editors debated whether publishing its contents would provoke backlash or violence. Some softened its language, others printed passages exactly as written, trusting the reader to understand its gravity. Even in edited form, the truth cut through. The letter became part of a growing body of testimony that made it increasingly difficult to defend slavery as benign or necessary. It added a human face to statistics and laws, reminding readers that every policy decision had real consequences for real people. Opposition was swift and fierce. Defenders of slavery dismissed the letter as propaganda, questioned its authenticity, or attacked the character of its author. But these efforts often backfired. The more critics tried to undermine the letter, the more attention it received. People began asking why such a document caused so much fear. If slavery were truly just, why did the words of one enslaved man threaten it so deeply? The letter exposed not only cruelty, but insecurity within the system itself. Over time, the letter's influence extended beyond moral debate and into political conversation. Lawmakers cited it indirectly, if not always openly, as discussions about abolition, reform, and human rights intensified. It became part of the cultural atmosphere, shaping how people talked about slavery even when they did not reference it by name. Its themes, family, dignity, suffering, truth, were universal enough to resonate across divisions. It did not demand agreement, it demanded reflection. For those still enslaved, the letter carried a different kind of power. Though many would never read it themselves, they felt its impact through the shifting attitudes of those around them. Whispered rumors spread of a man whose words had traveled where his body could not. The idea that someone like them had spoken and been heard became a source of quiet strength. It challenged the lie that enslaved people were voiceless or incapable of shaping history. The author of the letter did not live to see all of its effects. His life remained constrained, his fate uncertain, perhaps even tragic. But history does not always grant its agents the privilege of witnessing their own impact. What mattered was that his words endured. They were preserved, referenced, and remembered long after his physical presence was gone. In a system designed to erase, endurance itself was victory. As years passed, the letter took on a symbolic weight beyond its original context. It came to represent countless untold stories, voices that had been silenced before they could write their own testimony. Scholars, activists, and ordinary readers returned to it not just as a historical document, but as a moral challenge. It asked each generation what it would tolerate, what it would excuse, and what it would finally refuse to ignore. In the broader sweep of U.S. history, the letter became one thread among many that pulled the nation toward reckoning. It did not single-handedly end slavery, but it contributed to the growing pressure that made continuation increasingly untenable. Change is rarely the result of one action alone. It is the accumulation of courage, testimony, and resistance. This letter was one such act, small in origin, immense in consequence. What made it unforgettable was not its eloquence alone, but its existence. A man born into bondage had claimed authorship over his own story. He had refused the role assigned to him by law and custom. In doing so, he altered how history could be written. His final letter stood as proof that even under the most oppressive conditions, truth could survive, travel, and transform. The nation would continue to struggle with the legacy of slavery long after the letter's first readers were gone. But that struggle was shaped, in part, by the courage of a man who believed that words mattered, even when spoken from chains. His life may have been constrained, but his voice was not. Through that letter, he ensured that the silence imposed upon him at birth would not define his end, and that his story would become part of the story of a nation forced to confront itself.